Chiron woke up when the wooden side of the wagon struck the back of his head. The sun hung directly overhead and burned through his closed eyelids. His mouth was full of sand. His hands were tied behind his back with a rough rope. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know who he was. Then memories flooded his mind like a foreign current. The body belonged to Chiron Vale, the third son of the impoverished Vale family from the kingdom of Asteria. A month ago, Chancellor Malric had offered him a document to sign regarding the false debts of a neighboring family. They were planning to bankrupt the house and divide up its lands. Chiron refused. A week later, he was accused of insulting the crown. The trial lasted 1 day. The verdict sounded mocking. He was granted a fief, a land allotment for his personal possession, 12 square kilometers of the Ashra Desert, no well, no road. He was forbidden to leave the land on pain of execution. The wagon came to a stop. 2 guards dragged him onto the sand and cut the rope. The senior guard tossed a rolled-up parchment bearing the royal seal nearby. He said it was a deed of ownership and that the baron could enjoy his lands. The second one laughed and added that there was no water here for 3 days' journey in any direction. The wagon turned around and rolled off toward the north. Chiron remained standing alone amid the red dunes. He picked up the parchment. He scanned the horizon. Waves of sand stretching to the very edge of the sky. Not a bush, not a rock, not a shadow. He noted to himself that there was no point in panicking. Panic burns the water from your body faster than any sun. This knowledge did not come from Chiron Vale's memory. It came from somewhere deeper, from another life. He didn't dwell on it now. The first step was to survive. Everything else could wait. He tore open his shirt and wrapped the fabric around his head. He estimated the sun's position. There were 5 hours left until sunset. Walking in the daytime would be suicide. He dug a hole with his hands on the shady side of the dune and lay down in it. The sand, elbow deep, was cooler than the air. Another piece of knowledge, out of nowhere. He waited until the sun touched the horizon and set off. He didn't choose his direction at random. From the crest of the dune, he'd spotted a dark spot to the south. It was too flat to be a rock. He walked for 3 hours. The spot turned out to be ruins. An old caravan station. Collapsed walls made of clay bricks. A collapsed roof. And a circular stone ring in the courtyard. A well. Chiron dropped a pebble into it. The pebble clattered against the dry bottom. There was no water. He clenched his fists and stared into the black hole for a few seconds. Then he climbed down. There was no rope. He made his way down using the protrusions in the masonry. The bottom of the well was littered with sand and the bones of small animals. He began to dig. His hands quickly became bloodied. He dug. At waist depth, his fingers stumbled upon something hard and smooth. He pulled out his find and held it up to the moonlight streaming down from above. It was a white stone box the size of a fist. A sprout with 3 leaves was carved on the lid. Chiron opened it. Inside, on a faded piece of cloth, lay a single seed. Large, heavy, warm to the touch. It glowed faintly green. The voice in the body's memory was silent. Chiron Vale had never heard of such things. But the man inside the body knew seeds. He had held thousands of seeds in his hands in a past life. Not a single one had been warm. Not a single one had glowed. He did the only thing that made sense. He dug through the damp sand at the bottom of the well down to the darkest layer and planted the seed. He covered it with sand. He pressed down with his palm. And he felt something pull downward from his palm. It was as if a thin thread of warmth had flowed out of his body. Green lines flashed before his eyes. They hung right there in the air. The Oasis System has been activated. The carrier has been recognized. Ownership confirmed by the boundaries of the fief. 1 living plant, life water supply. 0 liters. Caravan froze. The lines did not disappear. He reached out to them mentally, and they unfolded. Every surviving plant within the domain's boundaries nourishes the heart of the oasis. The heart produces life-giving water. Life-giving water strengthens the host's soil and the host's body. A dead plant drains strength. Karen exhaled slowly. He looked at the mound of sand beneath his palm. A pale sprout was already emerging from the mound. It grew right before his eyes. Within a minute, it had stretched to the length of a finger. It unfurled two thick, fleshy leaves. The lines flashed. The life-giving water reserve was 1 liter. The host could extract the water by touch. Chiron touched the sprout. The leaf swelled. A large, clear drop formed at its tip. Chiron held out his palm, and the drop fell into it. The first was followed by a second. He drank in small sips. The water was cool and slightly sweet. As he drank, he felt the cracks on his lips stop stinging. He stopped at half a liter. You don't use up your reserves completely. He'd brought this rule with him from his past life, too, where water in the pipes determined the fate of entire villages. He sat down with his back against the well wall and began to think. 1 plant yielded a liter a day. An adult in the desert needs at least 3. That meant he needed more plants. He didn't have any seeds. But he had the most important thing: a source of moisture, a living anchor, and a system that turned greenery into water, and water into strength. He climbed back up and searched through the ruins. He found a cracked clay jug, a rusty knife without a handle, a scrap of a leather strap, and the most valuable thing of all. In a corner beneath a collapsed beam lay the dried-up carcass of a pack lizard, and next to it, scattered cargo. The sacks had rotted away. But among the decayed fabric, Chiron felt some hard little balls. Date pits, old ones, dried out, 12 of them. He held them in the palm of his hand and stared at them intently. The chances that even one would sprout after so many years were negligible. For an ordinary gardener. He climbed down into the well and touched the first sprout. He mentally asked the system about the dead seeds. The lines replied, "A carrier can infuse the seed with the water of life. The cost of awakening a single seed is 5 liters. The supply is 1 liter." Chiron smiled. The system was bargaining fairly. Build up the supply, awaken the seeds, expand the green ring. The plan was simple and therefore reliable. He lay down at the bottom of the well next to his only plant and fell asleep. He was awakened by a sound. Above, along the edge of the well, sand creaked. Then again, someone was walking through the ruins. Someone light on their feet and cautious. Chiron rose silently and gripped his rusty knife. His body remembered hunger and weakness. But his hands remembered something else. His hands remembered how to hold the blade in a reverse grip. He didn't bother to figure out where that knowledge came from. There was another creak from above. Then complete silence fell. The kind of silence that comes only when the observer realizes they've been heard. Chiron stood in the darkness at the bottom of a dry well, in the middle of a dead desert. Someone was waiting above him. And that someone now knew that the ruins were no longer empty. Chiron had awakened in the body of a disgraced nobleman, exiled by Chancellor Malric, to a domain 12 kilometers into the Ashra Desert. In the ruins of a caravan station, he had found a dry well, a glowing seed, and awakened the Oasis System, where every living plant provides the water of life. He has the first sprout, yielding 1 liter per day, a dozen old date pits, each requiring 5 liters to awaken, and an unknown observer at the edge of the well. Chiron did not climb out into the darkness. The one standing above the well is always stronger than the one climbing out of it. He stepped up to the wall and spoke in a calm, even voice. He said he could hear the guest. That he meant him no harm, and that he had water. The last word fell into the silence like a stone. There was a long silence above. Then the silhouette of a head appeared over the edge of the well. A gaunt face, huge eyes, A child. A boy of about 12 in the faded robes of desert nomads. He said hoarsely that the gentleman was lying, that the old station's well had been dry for 40 years, that his grandfather used to throw stones into it when he was still a boy. Instead of answering, Karen touched the sprout. He collected the water drop by drop in his palm and raised his hand toward the moonlight. The water glinted silver. The boy froze and stared intently at the wet palm. His face changed slowly. Disbelief, then bewilderment, then a hungry longing. He licked his chapped lips. Karen asked his name. The boy replied that his name was Kesh, that he was from the Varatak clan, that the clan had migrated to the Salt Rocks, but he'd fallen behind because he'd been searching the ruins for metal to sell. His water skin had been empty for 2 days. Chiron told him to climb down. Cash hesitated. Thirst won out. He scrambled down the masonry as nimbly as a lizard.
Chiron gave him a drink from his palm, half a liter. The system wouldn't give him any more yet. Cash drank, and his body shook. Then he sat down against the wall and said something strange. He said that the green sprout in the dead well was a sign from the old songs, that the clan's songs speak of the gardener who will come when the sands run deeper than the fire.
Karen didn't argue with the songs. Songs make better allies than blades. He said he needed a pair of hands, that he'd pay for the work with water. Cash looked at him as if he were mad and asked what there was to work on. There was nothing but sand all around. Karen explained. By dawn, they had hauled all the debris from the ruins into the well. Decayed fabric, bones, dried droppings from ancient pack animals, rotten remnants of beams. A man from a past life knew the value of organic matter in dead soil. Where an ordinary nobleman saw mud, he saw future soil. They mixed it all with the sand at the bottom of the well and dug small pits along the edges. In the morning, the system showed a supply of 1.5 liters. Overnight, the sprout had grown to knee height and unfurled its 4th leaf. Karen noticed a pattern. As long as he worked near the plant, it grew faster. The system confirmed it. The labor of the bearer on the estate's land accelerates growth. For 3 days, they lived in the rhythm of the desert. Work at night. Sleep in the shade of the well during the day. Chiron gave Kesha water 3 times a day in small portions and made sure the boy didn't drink it all at once. By the 4th morning, the supply had reached 5 liters. Chiron took the heavy estate pit and poured everything into it. The pit darkened. It cracked. A white root crawled out of the crack. They planted it in the prepared hole, and for the first time, Karen saw the number that changed everything. 2 living plants. A daily increase in the supply of 2 liters. The moisture boundary was 3 steps from the heart. He went down to the first sprout and dug up the sand next to it. The sand was damp, not wet, but damp. Moisture radiated out from the plant in a ring. The desert was retreating 3 steps. 12 kilometers of dead flax suddenly ceased to be a death sentence. They became a blueprint. Meanwhile, Cash had done what he'd been sent to do. Karen sent him to the crest of a large dune to watch the horizon. By noon, the boy had slid back down and reported that a wall was approaching from the southwest. Karen climbed up to see for himself. A brown haze covered half the sky. A sandstorm. A real one. The kind that strips the skin off and buries caravans. It would be here in about 2 hours. Cash said they needed to run to the Salt Rocks. Karen replied that it was too late to run and that there was nowhere to go. He looked at the storm and counted. 2 plants. 7 liters of their daily growth quota had already been used up. They had less than a liter left in reserve. If the storm buried the well and killed the sprouts, the system would drain their power and it would all be over. So the storm mustn't be allowed to kill them. They worked like mad. They blocked the mouth of the well with debris from the beams, crisscrossing them. On top, they stretched the remains of a leather awning from the cargo of a dead caravan and weighed down the edges with bricks. They left a slanted opening on the leeward side. At the last moment, Karen remembered one more rule of an alien life. Roots hold what walls cannot. He touched the heart of the oasis and asked the system if he could direct its growth. The system replied that the host could spend water at the root's command. He gave up his last leader. The roots of the first plant shot out wide and downward, entwining the sandy walls of the well in a living web. The storm struck. Above, the wind howled and bricks pounded against the beams. Sand poured through the cracks in thin streams. Cash curled up into a ball against the wall and covered his head with his hands. Chiron sat next to the plants, using his palms to brush the sand off the young leaves, hour after hour. He did not pray. He worked. The storm raged all night. By dawn, the wind had died down. They cleared away the debris blocking the entrance and made their way outside. The ruins were unrecognizable. Half the walls had been blown away. The dunes had shifted. The old world had been washed away by the sand. Karen climbed back down and looked into the bottom of the well. Both plants were still standing. The first sprout had lost a leaf. The date palm shoot was bent but alive. The system flashed green. The environmental test had been passed. The resilience of the domain's plants had been enhanced. The carrier had been granted accelerated growth at the moisture boundary. Kesh stood nearby, gazing at the greenery that had survived the storm that had buried the caravans. He slowly sank to his knees. He said that the elders of the clan needed to see this. That the Varatok clan had been losing its wells for the third year in a row. That if he told them about the living water at Old Station, everyone would come here. Chiron helped the boy to his feet and fell into thought. He needed people like he needed air. People are hands. Hands are growth. But a nomadic clan isn't just one hungry boy. It's 50 armed adults who have considered these sands their own for 40 years, and who might decide that it's easier to take the gardener's well than to earn it. He looked south, where the storm had passed, then at Kesha, and told him he could go back to his people. Kesha ran off before noon. Karen was left alone amid the shifting dunes. He awakened the second bone, planted it, climbed to the crest, and gazed long toward the southwest. On the third day, a string of dots appeared on the horizon. The dots grew larger. Riders on sand lizards. Many riders. The Varatok clan was heading toward his well. Chiron met a boy named Kesha who had fallen behind the clan. He hired him for water and, together with him, weathered a sandstorm, preserving both plants, for which the system increased the resilience of the vegetation and the growth rate of the moisture boundary. Moisture now radiates in a ring from the plants. A date pit awakens with 5 liters of water, and Chiron's labor on the ground accelerates growth. Kesha left for the Varatok tribe, which was losing its wells, and 100 nomads on sand lizards are moving toward the old station. Chiron met the tribe while standing. Not by the well, but on the open sand before the ruins. A man hiding behind a wall looks like prey. A man stepping out to meet 50 riders looks either like a madman or a force to be reckoned with. He was counting on the latter. The riders surrounded him in a semicircle. The sand lizards hissed and dug their claws into the sand. An old man with a face covered in nothing but wrinkles and scars rode forward. Kez had been talking about him the whole way. Elder Harum. For 40 years, he had led his clan from well to well. For the past 3 years, the wells had been dying one by one, and the clan was dying with them. Harum dismounted from his lizard and looked down at Chiron, even though he was a head shorter. He said that the boy was telling tales about a royal exile who grows water from sand. That he had lived in Ashran his whole life and knew that water doesn't grow. And that if the stranger had lured the clan into the wasteland as a trap, the clan would feed him to the lizards for dinner. Chiron turned silently and walked toward the well. Harum followed, his hand resting on the hilt of his crooked knife. The old man peered over the edge and froze. 7 plants were already standing at the bottom of the well. 5 awakened date palm shoots were reaching toward the light. The first sprout of the heart had grown to chest height, and its fleshy leaves glistened with moisture. A living network of roots entwined the well's walls, and the sand at the bottom was dark, damp, alive. Haram descended so slowly, as if afraid to disturb the dream. He sank to his knees. He scooped up a handful of damp sand. He brought it to his face. He sniffed it. His hands trembled. 40 years of the desert had witnessed the impossible. The old man raised his head and his voice cracked. He asked what the gardener wanted in exchange for the water. Chiron replied with words he'd prepared in advance. No tribute, no oaths, work. The clan would pitch their tents at the border of his domain. Every adult would contribute 4 hours of labor per day, digging, carrying, building, gathering any organic matter, from lizard droppings to bones. In return, each would receive a daily ration of water and a share of the future harvest. The clan's weapons would remain with the clan. But within the green ring, the owner would set the laws. One law was paramount. Whoever raises a hand against a plant is banished to the sands forever. Haram thought for a long time. Then he said that the clan had roamed freely for 400 years and had served no one. Chiron replied that he wasn't offering service. He was offering a deal. Free people work for pay, and only those who have nothing to sell serve others. The elder liked the answer. Thus began the first week at the Oasis. The people of the Varatak clan knew how to work. Chiron laid out the plan, and they carried it out. Around the well, planting holes grew out in a spiral pattern. He had brought the spiral system with him from his past life. That way, the moisture from each plant overlapped with that of its neighbor, and the ring grew not in patchy spots, but as a continuous front. The women of the clan wove shading shields from the stiff fibers of old tent leather and plant stems. The men deepened and widened the well. The children gathered everything across the dunes that had ever been alive. Charon revived seeds from the clan's reserves. The nomads kept seeds of tough desert thorns and bitter pod-bearing shrubs in sacks to feed the lizards. The system accepted everything. The water supply grew every day. 3 liters, 8, 20. By the end of the week, the green ring had spread beyond the well's edge to the surface. For the first time, the plants stood under the open sky. The desert looked at them and retreated. People came to the ring in the evenings and simply sat nearby, in silence. Charon noticed a new line in the system. The oasis had reached the first threshold. The taming branch is now available to the bearer. Desert creatures that drink the water of hearts acknowledge the bearer's will. He had to test this sooner than he'd wanted. On the 8th night, the lizards roared. Something short and swift burst out of the darkness into the camp. A desert monitor lizard the size of a calf. Hunger had driven it toward the scent of moisture. The monitor lizard slashed the side of a pack lizard and lunged at the people. The nomad's spears bounced off the bony plates on its back. Chiron didn't hesitate. He grabbed a jug containing a day's ration of water and splashed it into the monitor lizard's face. The beast froze mid-leap. The water of the heart ran down its scales, and the monitor lizard trembled all over. Charon stepped right up close and placed his palm on its snout. The system flared to life. The creature had drunk the water of the heart. Subjugation is possible. The cost was 30 liters. That was the oasis's entire daily yield. Charon paid. The monitor lizard lay down on the sand and pressed its head against his boots. The clan stood around, holding their breath. Haram looked at the beast that the nomads had spent their entire lives fleeing from, and which now lay at the gardener's feet like a dog. The old man said something quietly in the clan's ancient dialect. Kez then translated. The elder said that the songs had not lied. They named the monitor lizard Rash. He became the oasis's first guardian and its best digger. His claws dug through the hard soil faster than 10 men. Karen assigned him to the main task. Rash dug new wells along the line of the future spiral. The oasis grew, and along with it grew the problem that Karen had been thinking about from the very first day: water that could not be hidden. The greenery was visible from the crests of the distant dunes. Caravanners bypassing a Sharon along the northern route began to notice an impossible patch of the color of life. Rumors spread across the desert faster than the wind. The first to arrive was a salt merchant with 2 drivers. He regarded the date palm shoots as if they were gold and bought 3 water skins for the price of a fine blade. Next came a rumor gatherer from the border town of Tarnhold who bought nothing. He merely observed, counted, and memorized. Karen watched him go and realized that the hourglass had been turned upside down. Within a week, the entire border region would know about the living well. And the border region is home to more than just merchants. Harum confirmed the worst. He said that east of the Salt Rocks stood the camp of the Garrow Brotherhood. 200 blades, former mercenaries of the Crown who had been disbanded without pay. They kept the entire northern route in fear and took a cut from everything that moved. Water in the desert isn't a commodity, it's power. Garrow isn't coming to buy. Kairin stood on the crest of a dune and looked east. Below, behind his back, the clan's camp bustled. The spiral glowed green. Rash was digging the 3rd well. 40 liters more per day. 150 mouths to feed. And 200 blades 3 days' journey away, who would soon learn that something worth killing for had sprung up in the dead sands. He went down and gathered the elders. He said that peacetime had ended before it had even begun, and that the oasis needed more than just roots. The oasis needs thorns. The Varatak clan, numbering 150 people, settled near the oasis on Karen's terms: labor in exchange for water and a share of the harvest, under a law guaranteeing the inviolability of the plants. The oasis grew into a spiral of plantings with a daily yield of 40 liters. A taming branch was established, and for 30 liters, Chiron subdued the monitor lizard rash, who was digging new wells. Rumors of the water spread along the trade route, and 3 days' journey away stood the Garrow Brotherhood, 200 former mercenaries who would come to take, not to buy. Karen prepared for war, as one is taught to prepare not by knightly ballads but by the hard science of survival. First, he asked the system about thorns. The system responded generously. In the clan's seed pouches, he found seeds of the needlethorn, a bush that nomads used to burn away near wells because its finger-length thorns pierced the soles of shoes and left brittle shards in the wounds. Karen activated 40 seeds and commanded the roots to grow not in a spiral, but as a wall. 6 days later, the outer ring of the oasis was encircled by a hedge as tall as a man. There were only 2 passages through it, and both were flanked by the rampart walls of the old station. Then he turned his attention to the people. 60 adults from the clan were capable of fighting. Against 200 mercenaries, that was nothing in open terrain. Therefore, there would be no open terrain. Chiron deployed the fighters not in formation but in threes: a spearman, a shield bearer, and a slinger. The trios practiced meeting the enemy in the thorn-covered passages, where the enemy had no room to maneuver. The knowledge of how to hold a narrow passage with a small force came to him once again from the depths of another life, and once again he did not explain where it came from. Cash and his peers were given the most important task. Day and night, the boys riding young lizards kept watch on the distant ridges. Rash dug wolf pits in front of both passages, which they covered with mats and sprinkled with sand. And Chiron did something that made Harum recoil at first. He ordered a table to be carried out beyond the thorn bushes to the northern passage, and to place on it jugs of water and a platter of dates from the first tiny harvest. The elder said the gardener had gone mad and was feeding the wolves before the slaughter. Karen replied that 200 people were not a single beast with a single will. That's 200 thirsts, and thirst can be turned against its master. The Brotherhood arrived at dawn on the 9th day. the sentry spotted dust an hour earlier. Garrow led his men to the ridge, and for the first time, Karen got a good look at him through the spyglass he'd bought from a salt merchant. A burly man in captured officer's armor. The face of a man who had long since decided that the world owed him a salary for all his years of service. The mercenaries rode down and stopped 300 paces away. Garrow rode forward alone. He shouted that he'd heard water was being handed out here, that his men wanted a drink, and that the owner of the well could escape alive to the north if he left the keys to his marvel behind. Karen stepped out to the table behind the thorn bush. He said there really was water here and poured himself a full jug. He drank it in front of 200 men tormented by the thirst of the march. Then he said that anyone who dropped their weapon and approached alone would get the same, and whoever came with a blade would get sand. Garrow neighed and ordered the attack. From there, everything went exactly as Karen had laid out in the sand a week earlier. The front wave of mercenaries charged into the sand-filled pits. The front ranks collapsed and howled. The wave crumpled. Those in the rear pressed forward, shoving those in front onto the thorn spikes. The thorns worked better than any palisade. Garrow's men hacked at the bushes, their blades getting caught in the springy branches, while the thorns found every gap in their armor. Broken tips remained lodged in their wounds. In the passages, the mercenaries were met by trios. The narrowness of the pass eroded their numerical advantage. Slingers on the rampart walls pelted their helmets. And then Karen unleashed Rash. The monitor lizard struck the flank from behind a dune where it had been buried in the sand since nightfall. Its bony plates withstood the blows of the swords, and its tail shattered their legs. For the mercenaries who had spent their entire lives fighting humans, the attack by a monster under their command shattered something essential. Their formation crumbled, and then the table with the water did its job. The first to drop his sword was an aging mercenary with a face gray with thirst. He walked over to the table, picked up a jug, and began to drink amid the arrows and shouts. No one touched him, just as promised. Everyone saw it. A second followed the first, then a dozen at once. Thirst was eating away at the brotherhood from the inside faster than the thorns. Garrow roared and hacked down one of those fleeing. That was the end of him. His own men grabbed him by the arms. By noon, it was all over. 30 mercenaries lay in the sand. 50 had fled eastward. 120 knelt inside the thorn thicket with their hands bound, and Garrow stood at the front. Karen approached him with a jug. The mercenary looked up at him and waited for the knife. Instead, Karen let him drink. And then he announced to everyone that he was offering the prisoners the same deal as the clan. Labor in exchange for water and a share. An oath on the water of the heart. By this time, the system had unlocked a new ability for Chiron, and he tested it on the very first man to agree. Anyone who drinks the water of the heart while taking the oath is bound to the oasis. Betrayal will result in desiccation. The mercenaries took the oath one by one. They had seen what happens to those who go against the gardener, and they saw the dates on the platter. The choice was simple. Garrow was the last to swear the oath. Chiron left him in command of his former subordinates, because it would be foolish to dismantle an established structure. But he assigned Harem as his deputy, and placed a nomad in every squad. In the evening, the elder sat by the large well and shook his head. He said that in the morning, the gardener had 60 spears, but by sunset there were 180, and that he had lived 70 years but had never seen a war like this. The victory changed everything, and as always, brought a greater toll than before. 150 new mouths demanded water here and now. The oasis's growth turned negative, and for 3 days everyone lived on reduced rations, while Karen, at a feverish pace, awakened the seeds and expanded the second spiral. And on the 7th day after the battle, news worse than thirst arrived. The salt merchant returned and, over a cup of water, recounted the news from the north. In Tarnhold, songs about the battle were already being sung in the taverns. a song about the barren gardener who had grown a paradise in the cursed sands and crushed the Garrow Brotherhood with a man-made monster. The song had reached the capital, and there Chancellor Malric had heard it. The merchant lowered his voice. He said that the Chancellor had submitted a petition to the king requesting a review of the status of the Ashran fief. According to the documents, it appeared that the exile had unlawfully appropriated a strategic water source belonging to the crown, and that an inspection team, accompanied by an armed escort, had already left the capital. Chiron listened in silence. He watched the green spirals on the people carrying baskets and Rash digging the fifth well. Malric had stripped him of his name, his home, and his future, and exiled him to die in the sand. The sand couldn't finish him off. Now the Chancellor was coming to claim what had sprung from his own sentence. Charon clenched the jug so tightly that the clay cracked. He set it on the table and told Harem to convene the council. The Oasis had little time and a great deal of work to do. Charon met Garrow's Brotherhood with a wall of needle thorns, wolf pits, triples in the passageways, Rash's attack, and a table of water that lured the thirsty and crushed 200 mercenaries with minimal bloodshed. 120 prisoners, led by Garrow, took an oath by the heart's water, binding the traitor to withering. And the Oasis's power grew to 180 spears, despite dwindling water reserves. News of the victory reached the capital, and Chancellor Malric dispatched an audit team with an escort to seize the Oasis as an illegally appropriated resource of the crown. The council gathered at the large well that very evening. Chiron laid out before the elders and foremen a charter bearing the royal seal and explained the situation. According to the letter of the law, the land had been granted to him in perpetuity and without reservation. The judges were eager to humiliate him and failed to include a single word about the mineral resources and water in the deed of gift. The scribe's mistake became his shield. But a shield made of paper holds only until something heavier than paper stands behind it. You cannot meet an audit with spears. To raise arms against the crown's people is to give Malric a legitimate reason to wipe out the Oasis with his army. An audit must be met in such a way that taking the Oasis becomes more costly than leaving it alone. Wealth protects better than walls if you make it indispensable to the powerful of the world. This means that before the audit arrives, the Oasis must cease to be merely a well with a vegetable garden and become something that is not worth destroying, a trading hub. The next 3 weeks went down in the clan's songs as a time of great progress. Construction proceeded at a breakneck pace, with days merging into one. Here is Garrow, with his mercenaries, laying the first ring of walls around the old station out of clay bricks, while former enemies race the nomads carrying stretchers. Here, the women of the clan, led by Harem, are laying out the first covered market, with watering troughs for pack lizards at every stall. Here, Rash, with 2 young tamed monitor lizards, is digging the furrow for the future canal toward the northern road, while Kesha's boys are marking out planting holes along it. Here, at night by lamplight, Chiron awakens the seeds from a sack purchased from the merchants, and by dawn, an avenue of young shade trees rises along the canal. On the 20th day, from the crest of the northern dune, a view unfolded that took the courier's breath away. A green star of spirals. Within it, a city of fresh brick, a marketplace, a caravanserai with 40 stalls, 3 streets, a 1,000-liter water cistern, and a date grove from the first harvest. The system output a line that Chiron reread 3 times. The Oasis had reached the 3rd threshold. The bearer now had access to the branch of deep waters and the cultivation of magical herbs. He started with the herbs. The salt merchant had long had a small bag of shriveled moonwormwood seeds among his wares, which he kept as a curiosity. The capital's healers paid for a pinch of dried moonwormwood by weight in silver because it grew only in 3 valleys on the continent and drew all rot from wounds. Chiron bought the entire packet for a wineskin of water. It cost 100 liters to awaken a single seed. He awakened 10. The wormwood took root in the garden by the heart and glowed with a pale light at night. Thus, the oasis acquired a commodity that was more valuable than water and could not be grown anywhere else. The caravans came of their own accord. The first large caravan arrived on the 40th day, led by Master Delmar. 50 pack lizards, silk from the south, iron from the north. For 30 years, Delmar had led caravans through Acheron via a detour, losing a month's journey on the detour. He rode through the gates with the look of a man ready for a cheap spectacle. He told his drivers loudly that he'd seen a dozen miracle wells, and they'd all turned out to be puddles with painted greenery. Then his lizard pack animals made their way to the market's watering holes. Then he saw the cistern, the grove, the alley along the canal, a patch of glowing wormwood. Delmar dismounted from his beast, walked over to the canal, dipped both hands into the water, and kept them there for a long time. When he turned around, his face was that of a different man. He said that death walks directly through Acheron, and he had just washed his hands in the midst of death. And that if this water were still here a year from now, he would lead all his caravans along this route and bring the guild here. Charon named his prices: water, fodder, stalls, and secure lodging for a fixed fee. Wormwood and dates were for sale in exchange for iron tools and seeds of any plants Delmar could obtain. News was a separate item. The caravanners also paid for lodging with information about roads, garrisons, and prices. Delmar shook hands with him and bought all the first harvest dried wormwood. That same night, Chiron spent the proceeds, measured in system liters, on a branch of the deep waters, and the heart pierced the root trunk to the underground aquifer mentioned in the verses. The flow rate jumped to 800 liters a day. In the morning, a stream struck the cistern for the first time, one that didn't need to be squeezed drop by drop from the leaves. People stood around and listened to the sound of pouring water as if it were music. And 2 days later, Cacia's patrol brought the news they had been waiting for. A column was approaching from the north along the highway. 30 horsemen of the Royal Guard, 4 official wagons, and the standard of Malric's chancellery flying above the lead wagon. The inspection party rode through the gates around noon. It was led by a thin official with dust-colored eyes named Magister Olbrin. Chiron met him at the gate with bread, dates, and water in accordance with all the rules of the crown's hospitality. Olbrin declined the refreshments. He looked at the market full of Delmar caravanners, at the walls, at the grove, and quickly wrote something in his travel journal. Then he unfolded a decree bearing the small seal of the chancellery before Charon. The decree stated that water sources of strategic importance belonged to the crown, that Baron Vale was obligated to transfer control of the waters to an official from the chancellery, and that resistance would result in the forfeiture of his fief and arrest. The market fell silent. Garrow positioned his men by the walls and waited only for a nod. Harum kept his hand on his knife. Chiron read the decree slowly, feeling the weight of his own 180 spears and 30 enemy blades at his back. He finished reading. He rolled up the decree. And he smiled because he had found what he was looking for in the paper: the small seal, not the royal one. Malric's chancellery had not dared to bring the matter before the king, and the action was being taken bypass the throne. This changed the entire situation. Chiron told the magistrate that the crown had granted him this land as a perpetual gift under the Great Seal, and that a dispute between the two seals could only be resolved by the king himself. He said he would obey the king's word if it were spoken. Until that time, the chancellery's guests could drink his water on equal terms with all the caravanners at the standard price. Olbrin stared at him for a long time with eyes the color of dust. Then he said quietly that the Baron was playing a dangerous game and that the Chancellor does not forgive twice. He turned toward the wagons and ordered them to set up camp outside the walls. The inspection party remained at the Oasis to observe and send messengers to the capital. And by the end of that same week, a caravan arrived from the south bearing news that outweighed all the decrees. The drivers recounted it in whispers, as one speaks of the sea. The great rivers of the south had been running dry for 3 months. The rain rituals of the two kingdoms' temples had yielded not a single drop. A drought unlike any their grandfathers had ever known was sweeping across the continent from the south. And all the roads from the thirst-stricken south led through the sands of Asheron to the only place where water was not receding but flowing in. Chiron stood on the wall and looked toward the south. He understood that from this wall he was seeing the future. Thousands of refugees, caravans from the Three Crowns, armies that needed water more than gold, and somewhere behind it all, the Chancellor, who would now no longer seek to seize the oasis but would fear it. The oasis was ceasing to be a source of feudal dispute. The oasis was becoming the heart of the continent. And everyone would fight for the heart of the continent. In 3 weeks, the oasis had become a walled city, with a market, a caravanserai, a cistern, and an alley along the canal leading to the highway. And the system had tapped into veins of magical herbs and deep waters, increasing the yield to 800 liters per day. Chiron cultivated precious moonwormwood, concluded a trade agreement with the caravan master Delmar, and overturned Magistrate Olbrin's audit decree, pointing out that the Chancellor's document bore only a minor seal, and that the king would settle the dispute. After which, the audit team set up camp by the walls as observers. A great drought is sweeping across the continent from the south, and all roads from the parched states lead to the oasis, which has transformed from a disputed fief into the most vital source of water and a target for all the major players. The drought reached the gates of the oasis before the armies did. It arrived on the battered feet of refugees. The first family appeared on the southern horizon 10 days after the caravan, carrying the news had departed: a father, a mother, and 3 children. They crossed the sands on the last drops of water from the southern region's final dried-up well and collapsed at the gates. 10 families followed the first, then 50. Then the numbers reached the hundreds. People were coming from the border villages of the southern kingdom of Sarandia, where the rivers had turned into a string of muddy puddles. They carried children and the elderly on their backs, along with bundles containing all that remained of their former lives. Chiron convened a council that very first evening. Garrow spoke like a soldier. He said that every extra mouth to feed was a drain on supplies and that the gates must be closed before the crowd devoured the oasis from within. Haram spoke like a nomad. He said that the desert does not forgive those who deny a dying man a sip of water, and that the clan would not stand by and watch children die at its very walls. Karen listened to both of them and did the math. 800 liters of growth per day. 1,500 of our own, and a river of strangers that would never end because the drought would never end. Closing the gates meant letting a camp of despair grow at the walls. A camp that would one day launch an assault. Throwing the gates wide open meant drowning. He chose a third path, a path that in a past life had been called by a simple word: reception, accounting, distribution. At the southern gates, they set up long tables and 3-person teams on duty. Everyone who arrived received water immediately and unconditionally. The first cup was always free. Then came the choice. Those who wanted to continue north were given a water skin for the journey and went on their way. Those who wanted to stay signed a contract with the scribe. The very same contract, labor in exchange for water and a share, an oath on the water of the heart. The oasis needed workers more than ever, because Chiron was launching the largest project since its founding, a second spiral encircling the first, the outer city. The refugees dug holes, hauled bricks, and mixed clay. Among them were potters, blacksmiths, weavers, and one true master well-digger from Sarandia, named Tob, who burst into tears when he saw the canal's design. The system's output crept upward along with the number of workers and plantings. 1,000 liters, 1.5, 2. Master Olbrin watched it all from his camp by the walls, and his logbook was swelling with entries. Chiron knew that a messenger left for the capital every 3 days. He didn't interfere. Let Malric read about how what he had given to the enemy by his own decree was growing. At the end of the 3rd week of the Great Crossing, what was bound to happen happened. It wasn't refugees who arrived, a detachment arrived. 50 Sarandian horsemen in dusty blue cloaks flying the banner of the southern border lord. The detachment's commander, Captain Irvin, rode through the gates with the look of a man who'd been ordered to do something foolish and knew it. He announced his lord's demand. The oasis was located a day's journey from the disputed border. Sarandia is dying of thirst. Lord Ashgar demands that water be sold to Sarandia at a fixed price, set by the Lord himself and in quantities determined by the Lord himself. Otherwise, the Lord will come and take it himself. The market fell silent. Garrow smirked and looked toward the walls where his men were standing. Chiron asked the captain how many swords Lord Ashgar had. Irvin replied that there were 800. Chiron nodded and did something no one expected. He invited the captain and the entire squad to the tables as guests. He plied them with lizard wine. He led Irvin along the outer spiral, past the plantings, past the cisterns, past the beds of glowing wormwood. Then he took him to the south wall and pointed downward. At the base of the wall, in the shade of the awnings, sat hundreds of refugees from Sarandia. Women from Lord Ashgar's villages were cooking soup. Lord Ashgar's children slept in the shade of the Chiron trees. Chiron spoke quietly, addressing only the captain. He said he was already providing water to Sarandia, every day, for free, and that if the Lord brought 800 swordsmen, these people would take their places on the walls alongside his mercenaries, because here their children were drinking, while there their children had died. He also said that the oasis was ready to sell water to Sarandia by caravan at a fair price in exchange for grain, iron, and livestock, and that the captain could choose which of the two pieces of news to take home. Irvin was silent for a long time. Then he took off his helmet and asked for a bowl of water. He drank it slowly, as one drinks not water, but a decision. He said that his sister had left for the north a month ago with their 2 children, and he didn't know if she was still alive. Today he had seen her by the cauldron near the southern wall. The detachment had left at dawn. With it went the South's first trade agreement. 8 days later, Lord Ashgar's caravan arrived from Sarandia. 40 wagons of grain in exchange for water and wormwood. The caravans followed one after another, and with them flowed into the oasis what no seed could provide: grain, metal, cloth, livestock, and people. The outer city was already growing on its own, just as all living things grow near water. The system responded to this growth with a new line. The oasis reached the 4th threshold. The heart can nourish separate sprouts. The bearer can now create small nodes of moisture outside the main ring. Chiron understood the meaning of the line instantly. The oasis was no longer tied to a single point. He could stretch a chain of small oases along the route like a string of beads, a well and 10 trees at every day's journey, a road of life stretching across all of Asheron. He ordered preparations for the first expedition south toward the border. And that very evening, fate presented its bill. Kesh came running. The boy was on watch at the inspection camp and overheard what he wasn't supposed to hear. That night, a messenger arrived at Magister Olbrin's tent, not via the official route, but along a secret trail from the west. Kes crept up to the tent under cover of darkness. He heard only a little, but what he heard was enough. The messenger brought Olbrin an order and gold. In the order, Chancellor Malric wrote that the papers were no longer needed, that the right people had already entered the oasis under the guise of refugees, and that the heart of the oasis must die by the end of the month. Chiron listened and looked across the dark market toward the main well, where a patch of moonwormwood glowed in the night, and behind it, deep in the shadows, stood the first sprout from which it all began. Malric understood what few others did. There was no need to storm the walls. There was no need to argue about the seals. It was enough to kill a single plant. Somewhere among his thousands of people, assassins disguised as refugees were walking about, and they were already inside. The drought had driven hundreds of refugees from Sarandia to the oasis, and Karen established an admission system offering a free first cup of water in exchange for a labor contract, along with the construction of a second spiral, increasing the output to 2,000 liters. He turned the threat from the southern Lord Ashgar into a trade agreement, showing Captain Irvin that the children of Sarandia were already drinking his water, and the system had enabled the creation of small moisture nodes for a chain of oases along the route. Cash overheard that Chancellor Malric had sent an order and gold to Magister Olbrin, and that assassins had entered the oasis disguised as refugees, tasked with destroying the heart of the oasis by the end of the month. Chiron did not sound the alarm. An alarm is a cry, and a cry warns strangers, not one's own people. The assassins, hidden among thousands of faces, will learn of the failure and lie low to strike later, when the guards grow tired of waiting. So they had to strike now, while the enemy was still confident they hadn't been exposed. That night he gathered 5 men, Harum, Garrow, Kess, and Delmar, who was staying at the oasis with a new caravan, and Master Tob, who knew the outer city better than anyone because he himself had erected half the awnings there. Chiron laid out the task before them as one would lay out a blueprint. The assassins must be found not through a search, but through logic. Who are they? The Chancellor's men, not desert folk. That means they arrived recently. That means their names and arrival dates are in the scribes' records. Tob thought it through further, and his knowledge proved invaluable. He said that a true refugee from the south arrives completely drained. Such a person drinks more than the norm on the first day and then can't stop for a week. He always looks at water with hungry eyes. But the people who traveled the western route, well-fed with secret provisions, drink in moderation. The scribes recorded the distribution of water to each person according to the lists. Chiron and Tob pored over the lists until the third cock crow. From the 4,000 names, they first selected the 200 who had arrived in the last 2 weeks. Then they picked out the 40 who had drunk in moderation from the very first day. Then the 11 who had drunk exactly the right amount and had also signed up for work inside the first ring, closer to the heart. 11 names lay on the table. In the morning, Kesh's eyes were fixed on the 11. The boys of the clan knew how to be shadows. By noon, the picture had come together. 8 of the 11 turned out to be ordinary people with explainable quirks. 3 were different. The 3 didn't know each other during the day, but their routes through the city had crossed 3 times at a single point near the old, crumbling wall of the station. All 3 wore identical leather armbands under their clothes on their left forearms. And all 3 had signed up for the night watering shift at the main well on the last night of the month. Karen looked at the report and saw the hand of the office. Neat. Patient. On schedule. Malric had always loved schedules. That was what made him so useful. Karen decided not to take all 3 at once. The 3 were mere operatives, but the order specified the necessary people, without specifying a number. If there were a 4th and a 5th in the city, taking the 3 would hide them. Instead, he played a game he'd learned in a past life, where sabotage on the waterways was caught not through roundups, but through bait. He prepared a decoy for the heart. Overnight, with the help of trusted men, they cleared a new plot near the southern cistern and transplanted several bushes of glowing wormwood there. They erected a carved canopy around it. In the morning, a rumor spread through the market that the gardener was moving the oasis's first plant closer to the cistern under the new canopy, because the old well was going to be deepened. Rumor is like water. It finds its own way through every crack. By evening, the whole city was talking about the relocation. Meanwhile, the true heart was shielded by the best protection the oasis could offer. Chiron used 400 liters and commanded the thorn roots to weave a second inner wall around the old well. And Rash lay down in the well pit itself. The monitor lizard coiled around the first sprout like a mountain of scales and froze. The trap at the false heart was set with great subtlety. No extra guards. Just the usual night shift of Garo's disguised trios. The night of the last day of the month came moonless. Chiron sat in the darkness under the cistern's awning and listened to the city. The city breathed evenly. At the third hour of the night, the breathing faltered. Shadows approached the garden bed from three sides. Not three shadows. Five. Chiron noted to himself that the decision not to take the three had saved the entire operation. The two reserves weren't listed on any rosters because they hadn't come as refugees, but as drivers of one of the early caravans. The shadows worked beautifully. Two took up watch. Three slipped toward the garden bed and pulled flat flasks from their armbands. Chiron caught the scent before he saw the liquid. The bitter, oily smell of root eater, the poison used in the capital to ravage the gardens of disgraced houses. He whistled. The night erupted. Garo's trios closed in to form a ring. Two of the sentries went down immediately. Two of the three by the garden bed dropped their flasks and raised short blades. They fought as they'd been taught in one place, in the basements of the chancellery. The first managed to wound the shield-bearer before a sling shattered his knee. Garo took care of the second himself, capturing him alive by breaking his arm along with the blade. The fifth turned out to be the fastest of them all. He leaped over the garden bed, rolled under a spear, and would have vanished into the labyrinth of streets if not for Cash. The boy was waiting on the roof of a shed with a fishing net of the clan's design. The net fell from above, and the fifth man rolled across the sand, swaddled like a baby. In the morning, Charon interrogated the prisoners himself. Three remained silent as stones, and he knew that drill. There was no point in breaking stones. The fourth was enough. The young reserve among the herders turned out not to be a pen pusher, but a hired assassin from Tarnhold. He bargained for his life honestly. He told everything. Olbrand's man had hired them. Olbrand's man had supplied the poison. And most importantly, in case of failure, the magistrate had a second order ready to open the gates of the audit camp at night for a detachment that had already been stationed in the Western Pass for a week. 150 swordsmen without banners. Charon left the prisoners at dawn and looked at the audit camp by the walls. Neat tents. The chancellery's standard. Magister Olbrand was just having breakfast at his tent and writing something. Charon could have taken him right then. There was plenty of evidence. But to take a crown official with his own hand would mean playing Malric's game, where an outcast raises his hand against the chancellery. No, the official was to be devoured by his own paperwork. Charon ordered the captured mercenary to be brought to him, had him dressed in traveling clothes, and gave him a horse and his life in exchange for one last service. The mercenary rode west toward the bannerless detachment with a message on behalf of Olbrand's men. The message was simple. The job had been done another way. The detachment was no longer needed. Leave. And that same morning, a man from Delmar set off for the capital carrying a thick package. Inside the package were the mercenaries' testimony, recorded in the presence of 3 witnesses from the Merchants' Guild, a flask of root eater, and a letter from Chiron. The letter was not addressed to the king. It was too early to write to the king. The letter was addressed to the first treasurer of the crown, with whom the Delmar Guild had conducted business for 30 years. In the letter, Baron Vale humbly reported that certain individuals had attempted to undermine the source of the crown's revenues and asked for advice on how to protect the crown's interests. Charon understood the workings of the court. Malric was pressuring him in the name of the crown. That meant the answer had to come from within the crown, from those who handled the finances. The treasury and the chancellery had always been at odds over influence. Oasis had just tipped the scales in favor of the treasury. That evening, Chiron went down into the old well. Rash raised his head and shifted aside. The first sprout stood in its place, taller than a man, with a thick trunk and fleshy leaves glistening with droplets. Chiron sat down nearby, leaning against the monitor lizard's scales, and allowed himself a single long exhale. The assassination attempt had failed, but he didn't delude himself into thinking this was a respite. He had deflected the knife. The hand holding the knife remained intact, and that hand grew from the capital. and from the south, the wind carried the scent of dust, causing the lizards to lift their snouts. The Great Southern Road was black with travelers. The drought was only just beginning to drive the continent toward its gates. Chiron identified the assassins through the water distribution lists, and using Taub's method for identifying regular drinkers, set up a decoy heart by the cistern and captured 5 saboteurs carrying root-eater poison, while the real heart was guarded by a wall of thorns and rash. The interrogation revealed that Master Olbrin was behind the assassination attempt, with a backup plan to let in a detachment of 150 unmarked swordsmen at night, a plan that Chiron thwarted with a false report. Instead of arresting the official, Chiron sent the evidence and a letter to the crown's chief treasurer, pitting the treasury against Malric's chancellery. Meanwhile, from the south, a trail blackened by the marchers was moving toward the Oasis. The capital's response arrived 18 days later, not on paper, but as an event. At dawn, the audit camp by the walls broke camp of its own accord. Chiron watched from the wall as Olbrin's men hurriedly took down their tents. By noon, all that remained of the camp was a patch of trampled sand. And by evening, a lone horseman in the colors of the treasury rode through the gates with a dispatch signed by First Treasurer Rovin. The dispatch was written in a language that Chiron deciphered as one would decipher a cipher. The treasury thanked the baron for his concern for the public interest. The treasury reported that the audit had been suspended so that the audit itself could be reviewed. And the treasury informed the baron that customs duties from the Asheran route would henceforth be entered into the treasury ledgers as a separate line item. The last sentence was the most important. A separate line in the treasury ledgers meant that the oasis was now visible to the king, in the form most persuasive to kings, as revenue. Malric had been dealt a blow that could not be brushed aside by decree. To seize a revenue source recorded in the treasury's books meant waging war not against an exile, but against Rovin. Chiron allowed the city one evening of celebration with tribal music and a double ration of dates. But in the morning, he sent everyone back to work because the southern route, teeming with people, did not celebrate. The stream kept coming and coming. The oasis took in 300 souls a day, and that was the limit even for a 2,000-liter increase. Chiron set in motion what he had been preparing for since the day of the fourth threshold, a chain of small outposts. The first expedition set out south with Taub Kesh, 24 workers, and a guard of 3-man teams. At the heart of the caravan, on a sled beneath wet hides, rode a separated sprout of the heart in a tub filled with soil from the oasis. Chiron led the caravan himself for the first 2 stages of the journey. At the site of an old dry well, a day's journey from the city, they planted the sprout, and Chiron poured 1,000 liters of water into it all at once. By sunset, a ring of moisture 20 paces wide had spread around the sprout. Within a week, the first small oasis had sprung up there, a well, a shelter, and 30 trees. A rotating shift of 5 refugee families who had gone from being supplicants to becoming the station's caretakers. The system named it Node Number 2, and Chiron sensed something new. He could feel the node from a distance, just as one feels one's own hand. A month later, there were 4 nodes, and the chain had reached all the way to the Sarandian border. The road of death through Asheran had become the road of life, with lodging and water at every crossing. When Delmar saw the completed chain, he took his hat and said that in the guild, they erect monuments for such achievements. Tolls from the highway flowed like a river, and that river drew in those who are always drawn to big money. First came the envoys. In a single week, 3 diplomatic missions set up camp at the caravanserai. Sarandia requested a 5-fold increase in water sales and offered an eternal alliance. The western kingdom of Verlan, where drought was already scorching its second province, offered silver mines as collateral for the water. And the third embassy arrived from beyond the eastern mountains, sent by the steppe Khan, bearing gifts that made Harem's lips turn white. The Khan sent rare white war lizards and a message stating that the steppe remembers the ancient songs about the gardener and seeks friendship. Chiron treated everyone the same. Fixed prices, equal terms, no special privileges for anyone. He explained the simple mechanics to the council. As long as the oasis sells to everyone, no single buyer can allow another to seize the source. Every neighbor becomes an unwitting guardian of its independence. Water meant war for everyone, but none for anyone. Then came money of a different kind. The Tarnhold money changers proposed opening a trading house in the oasis. Chiron gave his permission, but introduced a rule that the money changers initially mocked. All transactions within the walls were to be conducted only using grain by weight, water, or the royal coin. No. I owe us from private households. His past life had taught him what happens to cities where money begins to be drawn on paper. The money changers grumbled but agreed, because walking away from such a market would have been foolish. The city was already growing on its own. The outer spiral had closed. The third one began. The first weddings were held in the date palm grove. Tob built a bathhouse, and the line to get in was longer than the one for the wells. Kesh had grown to the size of a palm over those months, and was already commanding 100 young boys on patrol riding young lizards. The system had broken through the 5th threshold and unlocked the branch of the great plants. Chiron read the description 3 times and sat down. A carrier can grow the mother tree from the heart. The mother tree stabilizes the climate within the domain's borders. The cost is 100,000 liters. 100,000 liters had been an unimaginable figure as recently as spring. Now, with a daily increase of 10,000 liters, that meant 10 days of strict austerity. Chiron announced a major collection drive to the city, and the city tightened its belt without a single complaint because everyone had already seen that the gardener's words became trees. On the 11th day, Chiron stood over the old well, placed both palms on the trunk of the first sprout, and transferred all the accumulated resources to the system. The earth sighed. The roots shot downward with the awe that made the dishes at the market ring out. The first sprout began to grow right before their eyes. By sunset, a tree taller than any tower in Tarnhold stood over the old station, its canopy casting a shadow over the entire inner city. Its leaves drank in the sun, and by nightfall exhaled coolness. And for the first time in Ashran's history, dew fell over the oasis. People came out of their homes, touched the wet railings, and wept. Harum stood beneath the canopy longer than anyone else. The elder said that now he had seen everything and could die in peace. But then he laughed and said he'd changed his mind because he wanted to see how much further the gardener would grow. The dew proved to be the final straw for the balance of the great forces. 2 weeks after the birth of the mother tree, 2 pieces of news arrived simultaneously at the oasis, each carrying the weight of an army. The first was brought by a messenger from the treasury. The king of Asteria announced that he would personally tour the crown's southern domains that summer, and that the route of his royal journey would include the Ashran fief. The king was traveling to see the miracle that was bringing the treasury a separate stream of revenue. The second piece of news was whispered to Delmar by a man from Virlan, and Delmar brought it to Chiron with a grim expression. The Western king was dying of an illness, and his heir, the young Prince Cassius, was mustering an army. Officially, it was to quell the drought-induced uprisings. But the regiments were converging on Virlan's eastern border, the very one beyond which lay the sands of Ashra and the world's only water source that never ran dry. Cassius's courtiers had already given the upcoming campaign a beautiful name, a pilgrimage to the water. Chiron stood beneath the canopy of the mother tree, holding both pieces of news in his hands. In the summer, his king would arrive here with a small entourage and old grudges. And that same summer, a foreign prince might come from the west with an army and a thirst for conquest. The oasis had grown too large to be ignored and too rich not to be coveted. The time of the roots was coming to an end. The time of the storm was approaching. The treasury had revoked Olbrin's audit, entered the oasis's duties as a separate line item in the state ledgers, and thereby shielded Chiron from Malric, while a chain of 4 small outposts transformed Ashran into a lifeline stretching to the border of Sarandia. The oasis received the embassies of Sarandia, Virla, and the Steppe Khan, who upheld the principle of water for all and no special privileges for anyone. and in exchange for 100,000 liters, Karen cultivated the mother tree, which stabilized the climate and produced the first dew. In the summer, the king of Asteria himself travels to the oasis, while from the west in the dying realm of Verlin Cassius, the crown prince, is gathering an army at the border, preparing a campaign for water. Chiron was preparing for both visits at once and treated them as a single operation. The logic was straightforward. If Cassius struck before the king's arrival, the oasis would have to fight alone. If he struck afterward, an attack on the very land where King Asteria had just stood would be a declaration of war against the crown. So the task boiled down to a simple one: survive until the king's visit, and ensure that the entire continent knew whose land this was. He began with defense, building it not around walls, but around distances. An army in the desert dies not from arrows, but from thirst. All of Cassius's strength hinged on a single thread: water at the crossings. Charon spread out a map of the western approaches on the table and saw what he had seen in a past life on other maps, where pumping stations had replaced the wells. Control the water along an army's path, and you control the army itself. 10 crossings west of the oasis lay 3 old brackish wells. They alone made the western road passable for troops. Charon sent 3 expeditions to them, but not to fill them in. Filling in the wells would give Verlan a reason to cry barbarism. Instead, a small chain post was set up at each well, a water station with a canopy and attendants, with gates open to any traveler, and with a ring of needle thorns planted in a circle, which in a month had grown into an impenetrable wall. Each station could provide water for a caravan, and not a single one could water an army, because the distribution of water was controlled by Chiron's will through the system. He felt every link as if they were his own fingers. Cassius's army would have to march 10 stages past water they could not take. The steppe formed a second barrier. Chiron sent a return embassy to the Kagan, led by Harem, and bearing gifts that could not be refused: saplings of shade trees for the steppe encampments, and a contract for the supply of medicinal wormwood. In return, he asked for nothing but blades. He asked only that the steppe allow its hordes of lizards to graze near Virland's northern borders during the summer. Simply to graze. The Kagan understood the beauty of the move and laughed as Harem later recounted. No war, but 50,000 steppe horsemen on the northern flank would force Cassia to leave half its regiments at home. Money came in as the third layer. Through Delmar and the money changers, Chiron quietly bought up the entire large supply of grain for sale in Tarnhold and the southern ports. Cassius's army was gathering in a starving country. Now any Virland military supply train had to buy bread through the markets, where the guild had the final say, and the guild was fed by the oasis. Garrow, observing all this, remarked that it was the first time he'd seen a fortress built from distances, grass, and prices. By early summer, the western road was blocked without a single soldier in sight. And then the time came for the royal visit. King Theodric II of Asteria rode into the oasis in midsummer with a small retinue of 300 men. Charon met him at the gates and saw before him a weary, aging man with intelligent, heavy eyes who had held the throne between his teeth for 20 years against men like Malric. The chancellor was riding in the retinue as well. According to protocol, he was entitled to a place at the king's right shoulder, and Malric held that position with a face as smooth as a river stone. Chiron bowed exactly as the law of vassal honor dictated. No lower, no higher. The king was not looking at him. The king was looking over the walls toward where the crown of the mother tree rose into the sky, and something flashed across his face that protocol could not conceal. Astonishment. For the 2 days of his visit, Chiron had followed a carefully planned itinerary. He had shown the king the market, where caravans from the 3 states were gathered, the cisterns in the canal, the groves of the third harvest, the hospital by the wormwood beds, where a refugee physician was already treating visitors from Tarnhold, the school under a canopy where 40 children from the clan
and the south were learning to count and write.
Treasurer Rovan, who had arrived in the entourage, walked beside the king and quietly recited the figures for the duties. Each figure settled like a stone in a wall. At the evening feast under the canopy, the very reason Malric had traveled across half the continent came to pass. The chancellor rose with a goblet and, in a voice full of concern for the crown, said that the miracle of Acheron was great and therefore dangerous. That a single subject held in his hands the water upon which 3 states already depended. That such power was beyond a baron's station, and that the crown should take the spring under its direct control and reward Baron Vale with a fitting title at court, far from the sands. Silence hung over the tables. The king was silent, gazing at Chiron with heavy eyes. He awaited an answer. And Chiron gave the answer he had been preparing ever since the day he learned of the visit. He did not argue about rights. He told a story, calmly and concisely. How he had been offered to sign false debts owed by a neighboring house. How he had refused. How he had been tried in a single day and sentenced to death in the sands, complete with a seal and a charter. He picked up that very charter and read aloud the line about eternal ownership. And then he said the most important thing. He said that the crown could take the Oasis. The guards will take him by the arms right now, and no one will draw a blade, because such will be his king's order. But the Oasis System lives through its owner. He laid a withered branch on the table before the king. That morning, he had severed it from a distant bush and ordered the system to cut the bush off from the heart. By evening, the bush had died, so everything will die. The tree, the dew, the knots of the chain, the grove, and the path of life. The crown will receive not a source, but the world's largest withered garden, and 3 thirsty states at its borders. Chiron spoke, looking not at Malric, but only at the king. He said there was a second way. The Oasis would remain his fief, and he would swear a full oath of vassalage to the king with one addition. The Acheron fief would be declared a free trading city under the crown's authority, with the right to water for all. Duties would be divided between the fief and the treasury according to the treaty. And then every caravan from Sarandia, Virlan, and the steppes that draws water here would become a caravan that pays Asteria. The king was silent for a long time. Then he asked only one thing. He asked why a baron, whom the crown had left to die, was willing to serve that very crown. Charon replied that there were different ways to serve. Malric serves the king through fear and paperwork. He will serve through water and gold. Let the king decide for himself which form of service will outlast them all. Theodoric II smiled slowly. For the first time in 2 days. He raised a cup of water from the oasis and, before 300 witnesses, announced his decree. The Acheron fief is confirmed to the House of Vale in perpetuity and is granted a charter as a free trading city under the crown. As for the trial of Baron Vale, the king is taking the case for personal review. The last sentence fell into the silence like an axe. Charon saw Malric's smooth face flinch for the first time. A personal review of the case meant that the king would read the court documents, and the documents were sewn together by the chancellery with the threads sticking out. The feast erupted with toasts. Rovan beamed. Harum banged his goblet on the table like a young man, and Chiron caught the chancellor's gaze across the tables and read it without words. Malric had lost the battle but not the war. Men like him do not surrender. Men like him change weapons. In the morning, the royal train departed for the north with a charter sealed by the Great Seal. And 6 days later, a disheveled messenger from Delmar brought news from the west that put an end to the summer. The old king of Virlan had died. Cassius was crowned in the field camp, and in his first decree, the new king declared that water was a gift of the gods that could not belong to a single man. Virlan's army of 12,000 swordsmen set out for the sands. The pilgrimage to the water had begun. Charon blocked the western road with 3 small knots of thorns at the route's only wells, hired the steppe Kagan as a passive threat to Virlan's northern flank, and bought up all the grain, depriving Cassius's army of supplies. King Theodoric, during a visit, rejected Malric's move after Caravan demonstrated the death of a severed bush and offered a vassal oath accompanied by a charter for a free trading city. The king confirmed the fief in perpetuity, taking the case against Caravan under his personal review. Cassius was crowned in the field camp and led 12,000 swordsmen to the Oasis, declaring the campaign a pilgrimage to the water. War came to the Oasis first in numbers. Kesha's watch network and Delmar's caravan scouts sent reports every day, and Chiron plotted them on a large map in the council hall. 12,000 blades of verlin, a supply train of 2,000 wagons, a 40-day journey to the border of the sands with ample water. But Cassius had no ample water. The steppe dealt the first blow to the army even before the first crossing. The Kagan kept his word admirably. 50,000 steppe horsemen simply migrated to Virland's northern border and settled there, herding lizards. Not a single raid, not a single arrow. But Cassius could not lead the entire army eastward, leaving the north unguarded. He detached 4,000 men from the army and stationed them as a rearguard. 8,000 marched toward the sands. The second blow came from the grain. Virland's supply procurers entered the markets of Tarnhold and were met with prices tripled because all the available grain was already stored in the guild's granaries. Cassius paid. The young king's treasury ran dry in the very first month of the campaign. The army dealt the third blow to itself by entering the sands. Chiron read the reports and observed how his fortress operated from afar. 8,000 men, and the supply train consumed as much water during the march as a small supply depot would provide in 10 days. Cassius knew this and led the army from station to station, hoping to seize water by force. The first station greeted the vanguard with its gates wide open. The caretakers had left during the night on Chiron's orders, taking everyone with them and emptying the cisterns. The Virlands entered the empty station, where water stood at the bottom of the well. The sappers began pumping. Charon, sitting 10 stages away under the mother tree, closed his eyes and gave the command to the node. The knot's roots contracted and drew the water deep into the aquifer. The well ran dry before the eyes of 8,000 people. Virland's chronicler would later call this the first miracle of the cursed road. The army pressed on, relying on its own supplies. At the second station, Cassius was already wiser and had sent a flying squad ahead to capture the station keepers. The detachment found the station empty, and overnight, thorns had grown all around it, closing in to form a solid ring. It took them half a day to cut through. Inside, the well had dried up again. The army began eating its own supply train and drinking from water skins by the second week. On the 15th day of the journey, the heat claimed its first victims. The supply train was falling behind. The lizard men were dropping like flies. Virland's field medics counted the sun's scorching rays in the hundreds. And then Chiron made a move that Garo called madness at the council, while Harem called it a song. An embassy from the Oasis set out to meet Cassia's army. It was Delmar alone, unescorted, carrying the guild's white flag and a caravan of water, 40 wagons full of water skins. Delmar rode into the dying camp and delivered the gardener's message to the young king. The water in the wagons was a gift to the wounded and sick with no strings attached. And for the healthy, the gardener had a proposal. The Oasis would sell water to Virland's army for their return journey at the standard caravan price. And it would conclude the same treaty with Virland as it had with Sarandia: water, grain, and wormwood, in exchange for iron and silver. As much water as the country needed. Forever. The only thing Virland will never receive is the spring itself. Cassius tore up the letter right in front of Delmar. The young king said he hadn't been crowned in the saddle to buy what he could take. He accepted the gift for the wounded, because the army was watching, and he led the healthy ones forward. Upon receiving the reply, Chiron nodded as if he had heard what he expected. His past life had taught him that young rulers must hit a wall before they start to think. All that remained was to set up a wall more merciful than the desert. The decisive battle took place on the 23rd day at the third station, 2 days' march from the oasis. Cassius arrived there with 6,000 combat-ready men and his last supply of water. Retreating was now farther than advancing. The desert left him no choice, and that was the whole plan. Chiron led his forces out to meet him. 800 spearmen from the oasis, Garrow's trios, and the clan's horsemen on war lizards. 100 of the Kagan's white lizards, ridden by steppe volunteers. And a third ring that the enemy did not consider an army. Rash and 11 desert monitor lizards, tamed over the course of a year, lay in the sand before the position like a ridge of sand dunes. The battle began at dawn and did not unfold as it does in ballads. The Virland formation advanced toward the spears of the oasis, and Charon committed the entire system to battle. A thorn hedge rose from the sand before the advancing ranks. The living wall grew faster than it could be cut down. The formation split into columns, and the columns poured into the passages where the trios were waiting. The monitor lizards struck from beneath the sand at the flanks, and the terror they instilled was greater than that of their claws. And then Chiron released 20,000 leaders all at once, and something happened over the battlefield that the desert had never seen before. The mother tree exhaled, a cloud rolled in from the east, and a brief, blinding rain fell upon the combatants.
The Virland soldiers, who had been dying of thirst for weeks, dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, catching the raindrops in their mouths. The war was over for the army. Cassius's men streamed by the hundreds toward the barrels that Garrow's trios were rolling out in front of the formation. By noon, everything had been settled.
The young king stood before Charon in the midst of his shattered army, without his crown, a flask of foreign water at his belt. He asked hoarsely what the gardener would demand in exchange for the army's lives. Charon replied that he had already said everything through Delmar, and his word would not change. Water and a trade agreement. The price was the same as before the battle. The oasis charges no more from the vanquished than from its guests. Cassius looked at him for a long time. Then the young king laughed bitterly and said that he finally understood what Ashran was fighting for. Ashran fights by making enmity seem foolish. He signed the treaty on a drum in the middle of the field. 6,000 Virlanders drank for a week, lived in tents by the walls, and returned home with water skins and grain purchased from the guild. Many looked back at the green star stretching all the way to the horizon. 300 men did not leave at all. They asked for a labor contract and an oath sworn on water. Chiron accepted them all. News of the victory thundered across the continent louder than the drought. And as always, the reckoning followed. A month after the battle, one night a messenger in the treasury's colors galloped into the oasis, having ridden 2 horses to exhaustion. Rovan wrote personally, and his handwriting was agitated. King Theodric, upon personally reviewing Vale's case, uncovered the chancellery's forgeries and issued an order for Malric's arrest. But the chancellor had vanished from the capital the day before his arrest. He disappeared along with part of the treasury's secret archive, including the registry of the chancellery's agents in the 3 kingdoms, and a wagon load of gold. And Rovan wrote of something even worse. Interrogations of the chancellery's scribes revealed where Malric's money had been flowing for years. South, across the sea, to the Karat Temple Alliance, whose priests mastered what was called the art of the dry land, and whose preachers had been traveling for a year through countries dying of drought, proclaiming that Ashran's water had been stolen from the gods. Malric had fled to those who knew how to kill not gardens, but the very earth itself. Chiron finished reading the letter beneath the canopy of the mother tree. Dew hung over the oasis. Below, the night market bustled with voices in 4 languages. He folded the letter and thought that the circle was closing just as it should. At first, he had had 1 enemy and 1 seed. Now he had a city, an alliance of 3 states, and an enemy who had finally revealed his true face. The war for water was over. The war for land was beginning. Cassius's campaign had been thwarted by distance, the steppe barrier, expensive grain, and the water running dry from the wells. And in the decisive battle at the third station, thorns, monitor lizards, and the reign of the mother tree disarmed the army, after which Cassius signed a trade agreement on pre-war terms, and 300 Verlanders remained in the Oasis. King Theodoric uncovered the forgeries and ordered Malric's arrest, but the chancellor fled with the gold and the secret archives to the Temple Alliance of Karet, which possessed the art of the dry land and declared Ashran's water to be stolen from the gods. The Oasis emerged victorious and became the commercial heart of the three states, but now standing against it a force capable of killing the earth itself. Karat's first strike came neither through an army nor an assassin. It came through words. 2 months after Malric's flight, preachers in gray robes carrying staffs of petrified wood set out along the roads of the south. They did not approach the Oasis. They traveled through the villages of Sarandia, the markets of Tarnhold, and the encampments near the steppes' borders, and everywhere they spoke the same message. The drought is the wrath of the gods. The gods have taken the water from everyone because one man stole it for himself. As long as that accursed tree lives in the sands, the rain will not return anywhere. Karen read the reports and recognized Malric's hand in every line. The chancellor had always waged war with paper and words before resorting to steel. The word worked. In the lands dying of thirst, people sought someone to blame, and they were given a scapegoat with a name already prepared. In Tarnhold, a guild caravan driver was stoned. In a southern village, the shed at Small Junction number 5 was burned down, and the overseers barely escaped. Captain Irvin sent a letter stating that at the court of Sarandia, a faction of priests was demanding the termination of the water treaty with the thief of the gods. Garrow proposed a simple solution: to round up the preachers on the roads. Chiron forbade it. A captured preacher is a martyr, and a martyr is worth 10 living ones. War is waged with words and deeds. He responded to Karat with 3 moves. The first move was a display of truth. Karen opened the gates to all priests, healers, and elders from any land. Come, see for yourselves, feel for yourselves. Delegations arrived out of curiosity and left embarrassed. They saw not a stolen river, but wells dug by hand. Not water locked away, but water sold to all and given freely to the sick. The hospital by the Wormwood treated pilgrims for free, and this refuted the sermons better than any argument. The second move was take-home due. A system from the 6th threshold allowed small climate saplings to be separated from the mother tree. Each cost 20,000 liters and took root only at an active node. Karen gifted the first 3 saplings not to kings but to temples. To the ancient Temple of Rain in Sarandia, to the monasteries near Tarnhold, to the sanctuary of the steppe. A month later, morning dew rose over the 3 temples, and the priests there went out on their own to preach against Karet, for the miracle was now growing among them. The third move was a question to which the Greys had no answer. The guild's heralds asked simply at every market, if Ashran's water was stolen from the gods, why did the gods allow it to grow? Karat's message began to falter. And then Karat showed that the message had been merely a reconnaissance. At the end of autumn, the first station died. Node number 7, far west. Chiron sensed it at night, just as one senses a burn. A part of himself went numb and faded away. By morning, the patrol had raced to the station and found what made even seasoned nomads' hands tremble. A circle of dead earth 300 paces wide. Not parched, dead. The sand had baked into a gray crust. The trees stood charred, though no fire had burned them. The well was full, but the water in it had turned bitter, and even the lizards refused to drink it. In the center of the circle stood a staff of petrified wood driven into the ground, carved with a spiral twisted against the sun's path. The caretakers had survived because they'd left that night to attend a festival at a neighboring node. Chiron stood in the circle of death and, for the first time since coming to this world, felt a chill beneath his ribs. The system responded to his question with a short message. The earth has been cut off from the streams of life. Restoration is impossible. The node is lost. So this was how the art of the dry earth worked. Karat did not cut down plants like a stationary knife. Karat destroyed the very foundation, the earth upon which everything stands. He returned, convened the council, and spoke without mincing words. The enemy knows how to attack what thorns cannot withstand and what rash cannot help. A single staff was enough for the station. No one knows how many staffs it would take for the mother tree. And no one knows how to stop them. For the first time in years, the council remained silent for a long time. The answer came from where they least expected it. Late at night, the old caretaker of the destroyed station asked to see Chiron, an elderly man from the first wave of refugees named Ansel, a man of few words and a herbalist. He placed a bundle on the table and unwrapped it. Inside lay a branch of moon wormwood that he had plucked on the day the station was destroyed, right at the very edge of the dead circle. The branch was alive, the only living thing in the entire circle. Ansel said quietly that the wormwood tasted bitter because it came from the same root as the bitter water. He explained that in his village, the elders called moon wormwood the herb that unties knots, and that if the Greys tie the earth in a knot, then perhaps there is a herb that cuts those knots. Chiron looked at the living branch from the dead circle and felt the chill beneath his ribs give way to excitement. He asked the system a question about wormwood and the dead earth. And for the first time, the system responded not with a line of text, but with an entire branch. A countermeasure to severing has been detected. A branch of deep roots is available to the carrier. The cost of study is 300,000 liters. 300,000. A month of severe austerity for the entire city. And the city tightened its belt once again without a single complaint when it learned why. While the leaders were being saved up, the war went on pause. A pause that smelled of a coming storm. The preachers vanished from the roads all at once, as if on command. Delmar sent one alarming report after another. Karat's ships were being unloaded at the southern ports. The Greys were buying up pack lizards by the thousands, and rumors were coming from across the sea that the great hierarch of Kara had left the Temple Island for the first time in 30 years, and that a gaunt northerner with the eloquence of a capital city scribe had been seen at his side. Malric had new masters and was leading them toward a destination he knew better than anyone. On the last night of the gathering month,
Chiron stood by the mother tree and looked south. The system indicated that the branches of the deep roots were ready for study, and Kesh's patrol from the distant southern ridge sent an alarm signal by fire. On the horizon, beyond the edge of the sands, the glow of campfires was rising. Not hundreds. Thousands. Kiarat had not come to preach.
Karat struck with a sermon about water stolen from the gods, and Charon shattered it by opening the gates, with the gifts of dew-soaked saplings to the 3 temples, and a question to which the Greys had no answer. Then the priests, with a staff bearing a reverse spiral, severed the 7th knot of caked-up dead earth. But the herbalist Ansel discovered that moon wormwood survives in the dead circle, and the system opened a branch of deep roots for 300,000 liters, which the city had gathered in a month. The preachers vanished. Malric was spotted alongside the Grand Hierarch, who had left the island for the first time in 30 years, and on the southern horizon rose the glow of the vast Kara camp. Chiron studied the deep root branch that very night, without waiting for dawn. 300,000 liters flowed into the heart in one long exhalation, and the system unfolded before him, a revelation that would change the entire course of the war. Kara's severance cut off the Earth's connection to the life currents deep within the roots. But the currents had a second channel deeper still. The branch allowed the heart to drive its roots below the severance point and nourish the earth from beneath the blow. And the moon wormwood planted in a ring held the edges of the wound in place, preventing the circle of death from spreading. This was not a shield against the staff. It was the ability to survive after the staff and to heal the earth. Charon immediately sent orders down the entire chain of command. A ring of wormwood for every node. A supply of awakened seeds for every node. To the overseers, the rule: Upon the appearance of the Greys, do not fight, but flee and lead the people away, because a station can now be rebuilt, but people cannot. In the morning, the first accurate reports about the guest arrived. Kesha's scouts had counted the camp beyond the southern border of the sands. 15,000. Of these, 10,000 were not warriors, but the flock. Barefoot pilgrims from all across the dying South, whom sermons had gathered under a banner bearing a spiral. 3,000 temple guards in gray armor, 1,500 supply wagons, and the core of the column, about which the sentries spoke in whispers. 300 priests of the dry land, carrying staffs. The column moved slowly and menacingly. It did not depend on wells like Cassius's army. At the head of the column, the priests struck the ground with their staffs, and where the spiral touched the sand, bitter water welled up from the depths. Water that only those who had undergone the rites of Karait could drink. The flock drank and pressed on with eyes ablaze. The Caravan desert was powerless against an enemy that carried its own water within its own faith. For the first time, the war council resembled an argument on the edge of a cliff. Garrow demanded a head-on battle on the distant approaches while the column was still spread out. Haram objected that slaughtering barefoot pilgrims would prove true all the sermons about the cruel water thief. Cassius, who had sent 2,000 Verlan veterans, as per the treaty, suggested waiting behind the walls. Chiron listened and looked at the map, seeing what he had always seen. The enemy cannot be defeated where he is strong. Kara's strength lay in the faith of his flock and in the 300 staffs. Therefore, the strike had to target the connection between them. He asked Ansel and the hospital physicians about the priest's bitter water. The herbalist's answer was the final piece of the puzzle. The bitter water quenched thirst, but dried a person out from the inside, slowly like a salt marsh. Pilgrims who drank it for weeks walked, their spirits free above their dying bodies. Their faith was nourished by the miracle of the staffs. And this faith had never before been shown another miracle. Karen built his defenses as if they were a sermon. 2 days' march from the oasis, across the column's path, a wall of greenery sprang up overnight through the combined efforts of the entire chain and 10,000 hands. Not a thorn hedge, not a wall, a garden. A strip of shady trees, date groves, and flowering grasses as wide as an arrow's flight and a day's march long. In the middle of the garden, open wells gushed, and tables stood under canopies, and on the tables were bread, dates, and clean water. And not a single warrior, only caretakers in simple clothes and healers with wormwood. Garrow had led all the spears of the oasis to hidden flanks behind the dunes, with orders not to show themselves until the gray iron bared its steel first. Kara's column reached the garden at dawn and came to a halt. Chiron watched from the command ridge as the 15,000-strong serpent stopped, its head resting against the strip of blossoms in the midst of the dead sands. The pilgrims in the front ranks stood and gazed at the water and the trees. Many fell to their knees. They had come to kill the accursed tree that had stolen the rain. Yet the future stolen from them stood before them, alive, and beckoned them to the tables. The first to break was neither a warrior nor a priest. A woman with a child in her arms stepped out of the ranks of the flock and walked toward the nearest well. The overseer silently handed her a cup. She drank and wept and gave the child a drink. Dozens followed her. Then, hundreds. The priests cried out about a trap and poison. Then, in full view of the entire column, the healers and overseers began to drink from those same wells and eat that same bread. The hierarchy of the miracle was crumbling. Bitter water from beneath the staff versus sweet water from the earth. The sermon versus the garden. The grand hierarch placed his final card. At his signal, 300 priests stepped out in front of the column, formed a chain, and simultaneously struck the ground with their staffs in front of the garden. Karen felt the impact throughout his entire body. The earth screamed. A strip of dead gray crust burst forth from the staffs toward the garden, scorching the sand. The flock howled in horror and ecstasy. And then the network of deep roots sprang into action. The garden shuddered but did not die.
The roots that had extended below the cut sustained life from the depths, and the rings of wormwood planted along the entire strip flared with a nocturnal light in broad daylight, while the dead crust rose at their edge like a wave against a pier. The trees above the dead strip blossomed. Karen poured 100,000 liters into this blossoming with a single gesture, because what mattered now was not supplies but spectacle. 15,000 people watched as the miracle of Karet shattered against the grass. The column broke without a fight. The flock marched by the thousands toward the wells, and the priests could no longer stem the tide because the guards themselves were gazing at the water. The hierarch ordered the guards to cut down those who were fleeing, and that was the end of it. The very first blow of gray iron against an unarmed back turned Karat's own flock against him. And from behind the dunes, at Chiron's signal, the spears of the Oasis and the Virlan veterans finally emerged and stood between the guards and the people, 3,000 against the sea. The guards laid down their weapons by noon. But it was not a complete victory, and Chiron realized this at sunset when the captured priests were counted. There were 260 of them. 40 priests with staffs, along with the great hierarch himself, slipped into the night in a small detachment, abandoning the army. And Malric went with them. Kesha's patrol followed their trail to a deep rocky ridge in the southeast, where the trail vanished near the ancient caves. A captured temple scribe revealed something during interrogation that caused the council to fall silent once more. The hierarch was heading toward the oasis for more than just the tree. Beneath Ashran, deep underground, lies what Karet calls the root of the world, the ancient source of all life on the continent. The stalagmites of the parched land grew from a branch stolen from it 1,000 years ago. The hierarch intends to descend to the root through the caves of the ridge and cut it off entirely. And then it will not be the oasis that dies. The entire land from sea to sea will die. Chiron stood over the map, staring at the mark indicating the stone ridge. The system was silent, but he could feel it himself. Deep beneath his feet, beneath the heart, beneath the tree, beneath the entire chain of nodes, something immense was indeed pulsing, something toward which all its roots were reaching. He had always thought he was building an oasis. It turned out that all this time he had been growing from the slumbering heart of the earth itself. And now, a man with 40 staffs and his old enemy were descending toward that heart. Chiron examined the branch of deep roots protected by wormwood and met Karet's column of 15,000, not with a wall, but with a blooming garden with open wells, which lured the flock exhausted by bitter water. The onslaught of 300 staffs shattered against the deep roots and rings of wormwood. The column fell apart. The guards laid down their weapons, but the hierarch Malric and 40 priests retreated to the ancient caves of the stone ridge. The captured scribe revealed that beneath Acheron lies the root of the world, the source of all the continent's life-giving streams, and the hierarch intends to descend to it and sever it entirely, killing the land from sea to sea. The pursuit force was assembled in a single night, and Chiron culled the ranks without mercy. You can't take an army into the caves. An army underground is a death sentence. He took 40 men, 20 of Garrow's best trios, retrained for confined spaces. Kesha with 5 lookouts, serving as eyes and ears. Ansel with a supply of wormwood and seeds. Toba, because the well digger could read stone and the water beneath it like a letter. And Rasha. In his past life, Varan had been a burrowing beast, and the caves were his homeland more than anyone else's. Before setting out, Chiron did what was hardest of all. He handed over control of the city to the council and looped the connection to the entire chain of nodes back to the mother tree to sustain itself. If the carrier does not return, the system will sustain the oasis for another year. A year for the city to learn to live without the gardener. He did not say this aloud, but Harem understood everything from his expression and silently embraced him as a son. They reached the ridge in 2 stages. The patrol found the entrance to the caves by following tracks and a dead marker. The priests had sealed off the mouth of the ancient passage behind them with a ring of baked earth. A branch of deep roots and a day's work with wormwood opened the passage. Inside, another world began. The passages of the ridge were no ordinary caves. The walls bore traces of gigantic, petrified roots as thick as a house. Tob ran his fingers along the stone and said quietly that these veins had once drawn water from across the entire continent. The system of underground streams, long dead for 1,000 years, Karen now read with his own intuition. The deeper they went, the more clearly he could hear the slow, immense pulse below. The root of the world was alive, barely, like someone sleeping on the brink of death. The hierarch's trail led downward and was marked by death. The priests moved quickly, burning everything in their wake. Twice the party emerged into underground halls where colonies of blind white grass and glowing mushrooms still clung to life, the last living threads of the old world. Both colonies were killed in passing with their staffs. Ansel gathered the surviving spores at the edges of the dead patches, and the old man's face grew stony with each haul. On the third day of the underground journey, the war caught up with the party. The priests had left a rearguard. In the narrow throat of the passage, where there was barely room to turn around, 8 gray figures with staffs awaited them as a trio. The first spiral strike baked the stone beneath the feet of the front 3, and 2 died before the party even realized where the attack was coming from. The fight in the narrow passage was brief and terrifying. The staff, wielded at point-blank range, scorched the earth and the air, but the priests were no warriors. Rash broke through the barrier, taking 2 blows to his bone plates, and the scales on his side fused into a gray patch that remained with him forever. The trios finished off the rest. Chiron lost 4 men and spent an hour using wormwood to open his scorched throat. He pressed on, running the cold numbers in his head. The hierarch had 32 staffs left. On the 4th day, the passages ended, and an abyss opened up. The squad emerged onto a ledge above a cavern the size of a valley. Light streamed up from below, faint, greenish gold. At the bottom of the cavern, rising from a lake of black, still water, stood the root of the world. Karen stared and didn't force himself to breathe for a moment. It was a tree, and yet not a tree. The trunk, as wide as a city square, sent its roots into the darkness beneath the lake, while its crown grew into the vault of the cavern and continued upward through the thickness of the rock. Karen understood instantly where that crown was headed. It was heading toward the surface, to the sands of Asheron, and one of its thinnest upper branches 1,000 years ago had reached the bottom of an old well at a caravan station and fallen asleep there as a seed in a white casket. His seed, his heart, his oasis. All of this was the last living shoot of a dying giant. The system flashed with lines he had never seen before. The carrier had reached the source. Kinship confirmed. Below, at the giant's feet, torches were burning. The hierarch wasted no time. 32 priests stood in a circle around the trunk, ankle-deep in black water, and were already performing the ritual. The spirals of the staffs were embedded in the giant's bark like gray veins. The pulse below was faltering, and a short distance from the circle, on a rock above the lake, stood a man in a traveling cloak, simply watching. Malric. The descent took half a day along the old root ledges. Chiron led the squad and felt something tremble in his own chest with every faltering beat of the giant's pulse. The bond worked both ways. If the root died, the host would die with it. He didn't tell anyone about this. They were waiting for them at the foot of the mountain. The hierarch was old but not blind, and a barrier of 12 priests met the squad on the last terrace above the lake. The battle spread across the ledges. The staff seared the stone. The trio cut down the grays in the tight space. Rash roared as he took blows to his plates. Chiron fought on the front line, and a branch of the deep roots fought alongside him. Where the spirals were fusing the stone, he threw wormwood seeds into the cracks and paid in liters, and the wormwood cracked the dead crust from within, tearing the priest's weave apart. The entire barrier fell. Of Chiron's 40 men, 26 remained on their feet.
A lake of black water lay between them and the ritual ring. And then Malric did what he had come to the stone to do. He stepped forward alone, raising his empty hands, and asked for a conversation. Garrow growled, but Karen stopped him. He wanted to listen.
The Chancellor spoke calmly, just as he had in the old days in his office in the capital. He said he had lost twice and knew how to count. That the hierarch was mad, and the death of the entire land had not been part of his own plans. He proposed a deal. He knew the ritual's weak point because he had spent months reading the temple archives. He would point it out. In return, Chiron would let him go, simply to leave alive, taking with him whatever he had. Chiron looked into the calm eyes of the man who had taken away his name, his home, and his first life in this world, who had tormented his heart and brought death to the root of the world, and who was now, as always, selling the only commodity he possessed: betrayal. Chiron asked only one thing. Where? Malric smiled slightly at the corner of his mouth and pointed to the far side of the trunk. There, amid the gray veins, hung the hierarch himself, fused with his staff into a single knot. The heart of the right. Killing the ring of priests is useless. The hierarch holds the weave. Chiron nodded and said the deal was accepted. The word was given in the presence of witnesses. And then he turned toward the lake and gave the order for the final charge. 26 men and a monitor lizard charged through the black water, under the blows of 20 staffs, toward the heart of the millennia-old drought. And deep beneath the mainland, the dying giant, with his last ounce of strength, gave his soul-living offshoot what he still could. A pulse, steady, waiting, like a hand reaching out from the darkness. Karen, along with the 40 chosen ones, Rash, Ansel, and Tob, passed through the sealed caves, losing men at the priest's barricades, and emerged at the root of the world, a gigantic subterranean tree whose last living shoot turned out to be his seed and the entire oasis. And this kinship meant that the root's death would also kill Karen. The hierarch, accompanied by 32 priests, performs the ritual of severing the spirals embedded in the trunk, and the giant's pulse faltered. Malric bought himself a reprieve by identifying a weakness in the hierarch's own ritual. The hierarch fused to his staff on the far side of the trunk, and a detachment of 26 men set out across the Black Lake for make their final push. The lake's black water reached waist-high and was as still as stone. The 26 men advanced through it in a crescent formation, and 20 staffs struck them from the ritual circle when they were 100 paces from the trunk. The first volley of spirals turned a strip of the lake into a boiling gray sludge. Chiron lost 3 men in a single breath. There was no cover. Retreat meant certain death for all. All that remained was speed and the cost. He shouted to Garrow to lead the trios in a wide arc to the left, drawing the fire away. He himself, along with Kes-Anshiel and Rash, moved to the right in a short arc toward the far side of the trunk. Rash led the way, taking the spirals on his mangled side, and the roar of the monitor lizard drowned out the rumble of the ritual. The branch of deep roots was working at its limit.
Chiron threw handfuls of awakened wormwood seeds into the boiling water and paid in liters from the tally of the entire distant chain. The wormwood sprouted directly from the dead water in jagged islands, breaking the priest's weaving lines, and each island cost a station a day's worth of growth. He could feel how, up there behind the thick stone, his knots were fading before his eyes, transferring their strength downward. The oasis was fighting for him with every fiber of its being. Garrow's trios reached the ring on the left, and the battle in the water began. The priests nearby were dying like ordinary people, but each managed to strike a blow, and every blow took the life of someone whose name Chiron knew. He charged in a wide arc to the right, counting only his steps. 50, 30. Ansel fell. The old herbalist caught the spiral intended for Keisha and disappeared beneath the black water, silently pressing his last pouch of seeds into the boy's hands. 10 steps.
The far side of the trunk opened, and Chiron saw the heart of the ritual up close. The hierarch of Kara hung from the bark of the giant tree, standing as tall as a man above the water.
The old man and the staff had indeed fused together. The gray wood ran through his body and spread across the bark in 100 veins, and the veins pulsed, drawing in the golden glow of the root. The hierarch's face was serene and almost happy. He opened his eyes when Chiron approached and spoke without defensiveness. His voice seemed to come from the stone itself. He said that the gardener was 1,000 years too late, that the world had long been sick and water was its pus, that only dry, pure earth was pleasing to heaven, and he was merely finishing what his order had begun at the dawn of time. Chiron did not argue with the man-staff. He struck. The blade cut beneath the veins and lodged in the gray wood as if in iron. The hierarch did not even flinch. His flesh had long since ceased to be flesh. And then the staff struck, not in a spiral outward, but with all its force inward, through the veins into the trunk. The giant screamed. Chiron heard that scream not with his ears, but with his very being, and the scream bent him in half. The root's pulse collapsed into the ragged thudding of a dying heart. The glow of the cavity began to fade. The system howled in lines about the severing of the source, and the bearer following the source. It grew dark before his eyes, and it grew dark in the world. And in this encroaching darkness, Chiron heard a voice from another life, his own voice from the past, where he had once stood above a village dying of drought by a dried-up well. Water cannot be held back by force. Water can only be allowed to flow freely. He understood. He understood why the blade was powerless and why wormwood cuts through the knots. Severance is a dam. You don't cut down a dam, you overflow a dam. He dropped his sword. He placed both palms on the gray veins and did what was madness by any law of war. He threw the system wide open in the opposite direction. Don't take from the root. Give to the root, that's all. He gave away the heart's reserve. 100,000 liters flowed into the veins in a single stream. He gave up the chain. He felt how, far above, the 12 nodes were fading away to the last drop, how the cisterns were emptying, how the mother tree was shedding its dew and falling silent. He gave up the city's years of labor, its harvests, its reserves, everything accumulated by all of Ashran, and the flow of life passed through his hands, through the gray veins, into the dying giant. The cut-off dam burst. The veins of the staff, designed to draw power from the half-dead source, swelled as they took in the sea. The hierarch cried out for the first time during the ritual. The gray tree within his body began to crack from the inside. Green shoots emerged from the cracks. Ansel's wormwood, from the bag that Kesh had emptied into the water at the tree's base, found fertile ground within the staff itself. The old staff flared with the green flame of sprouting and crumbled. 100 gray veins along the bark burst one after another. And the root of the world drew in a breath. A pulse surged from below with such force that the black lake rippled. A golden glow shot up the trunk into the crown, through the thickness of the stone, toward the distant surface. The surviving priests of the ring fell where they stood. Their staffs died along with the weave, sprouting green. The ritual was over. But Chiron still stood with his palms pressed against the bark, unable to pull them away, because now the flow was reversing. The giant was repaying his debt. The power of the source flowed into him so intensely that his body burned and his system choked on lines of code about new thresholds. He tore himself away from the trunk when he realized that a little more and he would cease to be human. The cavern hummed with light. The survivors stood in water that was becoming transparent and alive before their very eyes. Of the 26, 11 had made it to the trunk. Garrow was alive. Kez was alive, and held Ansel's empty bag aloft like a banner. Rash lay on the shallows, breathing. His scorched side entwined of its own accord sprouts of white cave grass. Tob wept as he watched moisture seep through the walls of the cavern, from the petrified veins of millennia-old death. Malric had vanished. While the final battle was still raging, the Chancellor had climbed up the root ledges and disappeared into the passages. A deal was a deal, and Karen forbade the pursuit. The gardener's word was worth more than a single act of vengeance. He did not yet know that vengeance was no longer needed.
A month later, caravanners would find the body of a gaunt northerner without a single wound in the northern passages of the ridge. Malric had died of thirst just a few steps from a newly formed underground stream. The water he had sold his whole life simply eluded him. The return journey to the surface took 3 days and was a path through spring. The caves were coming to life. Streams ran through the dead halls. White grass sprouted. Mushrooms glowed.
And when the party emerged from the mouth of the ridge into the open sky, all 11 stopped as one. Rain was falling over Ashran, the first real rain in the desert's living memory. Warm, steady, and endless. Karen stood beneath it, raised his face, and laughed, and water streamed down his face. It was impossible to tell where the rain ended. The system glowed quietly in his eyes as a final line. The source has been awakened. The mainland's life currents are being restored. The bearer has been recognized as the keeper. Far to the north, beyond the dunes, his entire land stood beneath the same rain at that very moment. The city, the market, the groves, the chain of stations.
The cisterns, emptied to the dregs for the sake of the root, hummed as they took in the heavenly water. And the people in the streets embraced one another because they understood without any messengers. The gardener had arrived. In the battle at the root of the world, the squad broke through the ring of priests, losing 15 men, including Ansel, whose wormwood had become the key, while his blade proved powerless against the hierarch, who had fused with his staff. Chiron triumphed by pouring the entire reserve of the heart and the entire chain into the dying root, overflowing the weave of severance. After which the staff sprouted wormwood, the hierarch perished, the root awoke and restored its power, recognizing Chiron as the guardian. Malric left alive under the terms of the deal, but later died of thirst in the caves, and over Ash, for the first time in its history, real rain fell, and the life forces of the mainland began to recover. The return to the city took them through new lands. The detachment traveled 2 stages, and on both stages they did not recognize the desert. The rain had stopped, but the sand held moisture, and wild grass, which Asheron had not seen in 1,000 years, was already sprouting in the lowlands between the dunes. At the 3rd station, they were met by Irvin's mounted patrol, and the captain leaped down from his lizard and embraced Karen, not with military formality, but as a fellow human being. He said that the rivers of Sarandia had risen by an elbow's length in a single night, that it was raining in Virlan, that the steppe was ringing with birdsong, the source was working. Streams of life spread across the continent like ripples on water, and each ripple was someone's salvation. The city welcomed the keeper without trumpets or heralds. The people simply poured into the streets all at once and stood in silence as the 11 and the monitor lizard made their way from the southern gate to the mother tree. And then Haram was the first to drop to one knee, and the entire city followed in a wave. Chiron stopped that wave by lifting the elder from his knees with his own hands. He told the city what he had been thinking the whole way back. It wasn't the gardener who grew the oasis. The oasis was grown by everyone who dug, carried, planted, and believed. He merely held the watering can. The city laughed and wept. That evening, beneath the canopy, memorial fires were lit for the 29 who had not returned, and Ansel's name was called first. Karen planted 29 shadow trees from the old herbalist's seeds above the site of the fires. The grove of the departed took root, every single sprout. Then, the time came to untie the knots, and Karen spent a year doing so. It was a year of great undertaking, and it unfolded step by step, just as any real work does. In the spring, envoys from the 5 powers gathered at the oasis and signed the Ashra Treaty beneath the mother tree. Water was declared the common heritage of all lands. control of the chain of stations was transferred to a joint administration composed of representatives from all nations. Tolls were allocated for the maintenance of the chain, and no one could block the path of life for another. Then, in the summer, Karen stands before King Theodoric in the capital, having entered not as an exile, but as the first Lord of the South. The king restores the House of Vale's good name and offers Karen the position of chancellor. Karen declines with a bow. He says he has seen up close what an office, from which one rules with paperwork, does to a man. His office consists of sand and a watering can. Theodoric laughs and lets him go. Come fall, Cash, now a wiry young man, takes command of the entire patrol service along the chain. Garrow becomes marshal of the Alliance Guard of the Trail, and the former bandit hunts down bandits so effectively that the Northern Trail is called the most boring road in the world. Ta builds the first school for well diggers in the Oasis, where students come to study from all the realms. And Rash dozes in the shade of a tree, and on his sun-baked side among the old slabs blooms white cave grass. Blooms as an eternal reminder of the depths. Now in winter, Koyarin descends into the old well where it all began. The first sprout has long since grown into the base of the mother tree, but the white stone box still lies in the niche of the masonry. He holds it in the palm of his hand, and the system quietly displays the result. 4 million living plants within the boundaries of the streams. 41 nodes in the chain. The keeper may pass on the small seeds of the source to those who are worthy. That last line is now his primary task. In the spring of the second year, Chiron distributed the first seeds, not to kings, to the keepers, to those who had maintained the stations for years and knew the value of a single drop. 7 people from 5 nations carried the warm, glowing grains to their homelands. And at the 7 ends of the continent, the tiny hearts of new oases awoke. The world changed not by decree, but through new growth. The drought faded into legend. Karat crumbled of its own accord when the rains finally reached the Temple Island, and the surviving gray priests sent envoys to the oasis, asking to be taught how to heal the land that their order had ravaged for 1,000 years. Chiron welcomed them and entrusted them to Tabu's tutelage, and in this there was more victory than in all the battles. One last knot remained, his own. At the beginning of the 3rd summer, Chiron climbed the southern wall alone at dawn. Below, a city of 40,000 souls was waking up. The market buzzed with conversation in 6 languages. The first barges were traveling down the canal because there was now enough water even for them. A caravan from across the sea was approaching the northern gate, while a school convoy was heading toward the southern gate, carrying children to see the grove of the departed. He stood and listened, and for the first time in both his lives,
he did not see a threat in the scene. His past life had taught him that water is power. This life had taught him more. Water is power only where it is scarce. Where there is enough for everyone, it becomes what it has always been. Simply life.
He climbed down from the wall, walked through the market returning 100 greetings, grabbed a simple watering can and a hoe from the shed by the gate, and headed for the far bed of the outer spiral, where a new row of moon wormwood had been planted yesterday. Haram grumbled that it was beneath the owner of 40 stations to be digging in the row. Chiron laughed and kept digging. A young caretaker, one of his recent students who was working nearby, kept glancing at him for a long time, then couldn't resist asking if it was true that the keeper had started with a single seed in a dry well. Chiron straightened up, looked south, where, above the ridge, the slopes of the once-dead mountains were already turning green in the hot haze, and replied that it was true. 1 seed, a little water, and people who didn't let each other wither away. Everything else grew on its own. He returned to the garden bed and carefully planted the new seeds, one by one, into the warm, moist earth. The earth accepted them immediately. The earth here now accepted everything. The awakened source restored the rains and rivers to the entire continent. And the 5 powers signed the Ashra Treaty beneath the mother tree, making water a common resource under the joint management of a chain of stations. Chiron regained his good name, declined the post of chancellor, settled the fates of his comrades in arms, distributed the 7 small seeds of the source to the guardians of the 5 nations, and the repentant priests of Kara became disciples of earth healing. The guardian, who found a single seed in a dry well, lives as a gardener in the heart of the blossoming continent and plants new seeds in the earth, which now accepts everything,